What I want to challenge today is the validity of this idea that monetary policymakers can correctly identify asset price bubbles and respond to them preemptively, or at least ahead of time. Now, this is something where monetary policymakers, a number of them who even used to be skeptical, seem to switch their positions. So if you go back 2 years ago to this conference, Don Cohn gave a speech here in which he explicitly said, well, I used to think I couldn't identify bubbles, but now I realize you probably can. And this actually is an example of senior policymakers shifting on this position. That is wrong. It is wrong to do. I realize it's a lot of fun for central bankers to channel the late Justice Potter Stewart and say, I know obscene asset prices when I see them, but I don't think that's the way to make policy. So what I'm going to do, and this is based on joint work in progress I'm doing with two people at the Bank of England, Thomas Hillebrandt and Neil Meads, and again, the detailed data and all that will be out with the journal in due course. I'm just going to go through some basic facts about booms and busts as we've been able to identify them and point out that the record is much more complicated than people think. And in light of these patterns, it is a very daunting thing to get the call right, that when it's time to pop an asset price bubble and when you know an asset price bubble or boom is going on. Now, I want to add that this isn't because I'm convinced that financial markets get prices right all the time. That's not my concern. And nor is it because I don't want central bankers to ever make judgments. I tend to be more on the rule side than the discretion side than a lot of central bankers, but there's certainly room for judgment. The issue of ignorance here is specific to the nature of asset booms and busts, that we simply do not have enough good information in real time to respond. So the first point I want to make is some booms are different. Now, everybody's riffing on Carmen and Ken Rogoff's classic book title. It's my turn to do that. So let me talk about a bit the diversity of various different types of bubbles. And I gather that the second Lawrence White, who's speaking today, is going to talk about this as well from his slides. It turns out that some things that are taken for granted about booms and busts are not true. So it helps to try to have some sort of objective record, at least retrospectively, of what were the busts and the booms, so you can try then to do research on it. So my co-authors and I went out and we took some data sets and we essentially took two different methods for identifying asset price booms and busts. So one follows Michael Bordeaux and Olivier Jean, and we said, okay, look at sustained deviations from moving averages of growth rates. Another one following Charles Goodhart and Boris Hoffman and others. You do a fancier econometric thing and you use a Hodrick-Prescott filter and you estimate trends in asset price movements, whatever. I'm happy to answer technical questions, so that's not the point today. I'm very glad to be in an auditorium with no PowerPoint screen. It's all very nice. So what we do is we take 17 advanced economies, go back to the early 70s to the present, include the recent times, and look at residential prices, real estate prices, equity prices, identify periods of booms and busts. We come up with two separate lists. Lists are not identical, but they catch, obviously, overlapping. Both of them think there was a boom in Japan in the late 80s, for example. And so the first thing that leaps out at you is if you just do the simple descriptive statistics, looking at these lists, is that not every boom is followed by a bust, and not every boom is followed by a crash. So, for example, we identified using one method, the growth rate method, 42 real estate booms and 50 equity booms over this period among these countries. Of these, only 16 of the real estate booms were followed by a bust within 2 years, and only 12 out of 50 of the equity booms were followed by a bust, a crash in prices over 2 years. In fact, if you use the other method, you get similar results. You only get equity busts, for example, following booms in 13 out of 51 cases. Now, as a policymaker, you may not care about equity booms and busts per se, so maybe you care about recessions. Turns out you can do the same exercise. It is roughly a quarter or less of cases. It depends specifically which list you look at, whether you look at real estate or whether you look at equity prices, but it never really exceeds a quarter of cases in which even long sustained large equity price or real estate booms are followed by a recession or are followed by an asset price bust. Now, in other words, what goes up need not come down when you're talking about asset prices. Now, for policymaking, this is a very simple point, but it's actually very profound. It means if you target asset prices literally, and you say, I'm going to keep asset prices from going up, I'm going to respond when there seems to be an excessive boom in asset prices, you're going to be forced to cut off 3 booms that would not do any harm, and in arguably, at least in equity boom cases, sometimes do some good, for every one that you preempt. Moreover, as Brad DeLong has argued, as Rick Mishkin has argued, as I've argued, and I gather Larry White's going to argue, there are differences in some of these booms. Some of these booms are associated with technological changes. Think of Greenspan and the IT boom in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. These are not things you want to casually cut off. So if you're going to do this, you need a lot more information than you currently have to tell you which of these booms are the good ones or the bad ones. You can't just do it on prices alone. Now you can say, well, no one was going to just do it on prices alone, but actually, if you follow the discussion in central banks and the people coming out of the BIS and a lot of the proposals, it was proposed essentially that you do it on asset prices alone. And that is not a straw man, and it is something to avoid. But complicating matters further is just the matter of timing. Again, we have these periods, these episodes we identified, so we're able to talk about how long they last, how much appreciation you have in each of these periods. And it turns out that on average, equity booms, absent central bank intervention, generally run about 2 years. And real estate booms generally run about 3 years. Now, real estate booms have a much longer tail. Both booms and busts, there tends to be a distribution. There are some that go on forever. Think of the German real estate bust of the 90s post-reunification that goes on for 10 years. But more than half of each type of boom bust is over in 2 to 3 years. Now, in our mechanical statistical method, it takes you 4 quarters just to figure out that you've got a sustained asset price boom. You could say, well, the central bankers are going to be much more clever and they're not going to wait around for that. I think that's a false hope. I think it would, in fact, be the very opposite of Milton Friedman's dictum that you don't over fine-tune the economy with monetary policy if you wait only 2 to 3 quarters and say, I don't like the looks of that stock market, I'm going to raise rates. So by the time you wait 4 quarters to decide you're in the midst of a boom, and then it takes you a little while to raise the rates enough to have the effect you want, the boom, more than 50% of the time, would already have been over. So in practical terms, this whole thing just doesn't make any sense. Moreover, if you're really a leaning against the wind advocate, you can say, well, maybe you're right, maybe if we did that, we'd be chasing our tail. But in reality, the point is you make a commitment that you're going to pop asset price bubbles, and that deters this behavior in the first place, and you don't have to do this. Now, I'm not quite the macroeconomic historian that Charlie or Carmen are, but I know a little bit about this. The last 40 years of monetary policy making is littered with the corpses of credible central bank commitments and their ability to influence private sector behavior, let us say. And so if you want to build in place a rule, something like more like an exchange rate peg that says you're going to intervene, then it has to be simple and dumb usually. And that's not going to work very well either. Now, it could be, and this is something I'm investigating, that booms that are particularly long are the particularly dangerous ones. And you may want to intervene when you see a boom going on too long. That's worth thinking about. But that's a very different kind of attitude for policy to take than this preemptive lean against the wind when you first see it.